Good afternoon. Today I want to share with you the story of a remarkable people, ancestral Pueblo Indians, who lived a life on the edge that's hard for us today, surrounded by our creature comforts, to imagine. Pueblo people lived in the Southwest for 4,000 years. They were and still are a remarkable people. Today they live in 21 different sovereign nations located mostly in New Mexico and Arizona. They still speak their own languages, they practice their own religions, and they maintain traditions that connect them with their ancestral past. I'm really lucky, and I don't know how I got so lucky to make anthropology and archaeology my life's work. But then I got luckier still to study Pueblo Indians, and then even luckier to do all of this at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. It's a nonprofit research and education center in southwestern Colorado where I work with a team of researchers and educators and with students who come from all over the country to help us with our research in the context of our public education programs. And probably the best part of my job is that I work and partner with American Indians to design and deliver those research and education programs. My work focuses on the Mesa Verde region, which is one of the most important archaeological regions in the world. Ancestral Pueblo people who live there left behind some of the most well-preserved sites that anywhere that you can find, and an array of beautiful artifacts. What we know from our work at Crow Canyon is that the beginnings of this society is tied to one of the most important transitions in human history, the shift from hunting and gathering to domesticated food production. And in the case of the Pueblos, that domesticated food production was corn farming. Now, this archaeological story of Pueblo people's origins overlaps with the way they think about their own beginnings. For example, the Hopi people believe that they lived in a series of 3 underworlds before emerging into this world. And when they emerged into this 4th world, they encountered a guardian spirit that they call Masao. And Masao gave them guidance. He gave them a planting stick, a bag of seeds, a gourd of water, and a small ear of blue corn, enabling them to begin this new life as farmers. So Pueblo people, like archaeologists, trace their origins to the introduction of agriculture. And corn farming remain a key aspect of Pueblo Indian society today. In this video clip, a couple of traditional Hopi farmers are using these traditional methods and the seed that has been preserved by their ancestors, and they're helping us plant gardens, experimental gardens at Crow Canyon to evaluate how the agricultural yields were affected by annual change in climate. Now, this move from hunting and gathering to agriculture pulled Pueblo people away from the edge in one respect. For the first time, they had a source of food that they could store in great quantities and that they could share with each other during times of need. But in another respect, it moved them closer to an edge because for the first time, they became dependent on a single source of food for the bulk of their calories. Mesa Verde Pueblo farmers were also close to the edge because they did this farming in a landscape that was prone to drought and cold and short growing seasons, so a successful harvest wasn't always assured. I've been studying this as a part of a new research project with a group of colleagues that is called the Village Ecodynamics Project. Got to acknowledge the National Science Foundation that funded this project. And we just refer to this as the VEP. So my VEP scholars and myself, one of the analyses we've done is to analyze tree rings to reconstruct the amount of precipitation and the temperature from each year in the past. And then we combine that with our map of the soils in the region, and we estimate the amount of corn that could be grown on that landscape during every year and how it changed during every year with the changing climate. This graph illustrates our reconstruction of agricultural production for a 700-year period between AD 600 and AD 1300. This is the 700 years when Pueblo people lived in the Mesa Verde region in the greatest numbers. And it's also at the end of this period, around AD 1300, when they migrated from the region, leaving it entirely depopulated. So when you look at this crazy graph, look at that yellow line. That's the 700-year average. Every bar on this graph is an individual year. So the bars that go above the yellow line are years with greater than average harvest, those below, lower than average harvest. The black bars in the white band are years that were pretty close to the average. The green bars are unusually wet years that had exceptionally good harvests. And the red bars are years where drought and cold limited the harvest and maybe even created no harvest. There's 104 of these catastrophically low years, or 1 year in 7 when people's survival would have been threatened by little harvest. The situation is even more dramatic in the final century. In the AD 1200s, 69 out of 100 years were below average, and 19 of those years, or 1 in 5, were catastrophically low. Now, you might think this would be a time that people would have avoided living in the Mesa Verde region. But in another study I've done with my VEP colleagues, we found that just the opposite is true. Despite the deteriorating climate and the low agricultural yields of the 13th century, this is when population peaked in the region, and 25,000 people lived there, about the same number of people that live there today. So this is a really volatile mix. Increasing population at the same time that you have deteriorating climate and low yields. And what happened is we see a whole suite of other dramatic changes that occur at this same time. Our computer simulation and our analysis of the artifacts and ecofacts that come from our excavation of archaeological sites show that 700 years of living in the region was beginning to deplete natural resources. Another big change is in the size of the settlements. For most of the time that Pueblo people lived in this region, they lived in small single-family farms. But in the 13th century, they increasingly move into larger aggregated villages. And the size or the location of those settlements also changes. For 600 years, they'd been living on the mesa tops and putting their houses directly on the soils that were the best soils for farming. And in the 13th century, they suddenly moved to the canyons, where for the first time they locate their settlements right on the springs that are their only source of water. This move to the canyons also reflects a defensive quality to these settlements. And several independent lines of evidence show that conflict and warfare was in fact increasing in the 13th century. And ultimately, it's this group of factors that provides the context for Mesa Verde Pueblo people immigrating and leaving the Mesa Verde region. Now, when they moved from the region, these people from the Mesa Verde region, some of them probably ended up in all of the places where Pueblo Indians live today. But my colleague Scott Ortman has shown that most people in the Mesa Verde region spoke the language of Tewa, and that when they moved to the portion of the Rio Grande where Tewa is still spoken by Pueblo people today. So this is this story of Mesa Verde Pueblo people living on this edge as corn farmers in this arid, high-altitude landscape. And I think it has many lessons to teach us today. The first lesson is that they survived there successfully for centuries, even millennia, several thousands of years. So they clearly created an economy that was sustainable and a social and political organization that was resilient. And by resilient, I mean they had a social and political organization that could withstand these constant disturbances of drought and poor agricultural yields. But the second lesson that we learn from this society is that in the 13th century, it lost its resiliency. And they left. They moved to a new locale and reinvented their communities in this new location on the Rio Grande. So how do we understand this? When we look at our VEP computer simulation and our analysis of the agricultural sites, it becomes clear that these external factors that I've been talking about, drought, low yields, natural resource depletion, all of these external factors can't fully explain this depopulation. For example, it doesn't explain why just some people didn't leave and reducing the population levels to a size that was sustainable. It also doesn't explain why they didn't come back when things got better, which they'd done countless times in the past. So what is the answer? I think it comes back to the internal workings of this society, and that something changed in the 13th century, and Mesa Verde Pueblo society lost this resiliency that I'm talking about. The reason I think this is all of these iconic artifacts that defined Mesa Verde society disappear when they move. They didn't make any more small kivas. They didn't make the same kind of pottery, and particular vessel types like kiva jars and mugs don't appear in the new place where they moved to. They no longer built towers. When they move to the Rio Grande, they create new sites that don't look anything like the Mesa Verde villages. And we can compare those two villages to try and understand why this is so. And when we do that, what we see is that the Mesa Verde villages really privileged household autonomy. But in these new Rio Grande villages, households were de-emphasized, and there's a new emphasis on the entire community. Now, communities are still the defining characteristic of Pueblo societies today. And Pueblo people have an explicit set of values that they talk about, that are the values that they believe you have to uphold to be a good Pueblo person and to keep their communities together. And chief among those values are cooperation and sharing. These values are stressed in the lives of individuals in their daily lives, and they're reenacted in their community ceremonies. So I really think this is the key and the transformation of Pueblo society that occurred when people left the Mesa Verde region and moved to the Rio Grande. So I want to close by reflecting on how much I love being an archaeologist. I think archaeology, more than any other discipline, because its subject matter is all of human occupation on this planet through the entire time that we've been here. So more than any other discipline, it gives us an understanding of the full expression of our collective humanity. And it really allows us to appreciate the incredible diversity of human life on this planet. And ultimately, I think that's the best measuring stick to evaluate our society today and our lives as individuals. You know, I think these Pueblo folks have a lot to teach us. And I think the study of the deep Pueblo past has a lot to teach us. It teaches us that technologies have to be sustainable for societies to make it over the long term. It teaches us that social and political organization has to remain resilient to deal with the challenges that are inevitably going to occur. And living Pueblo people teach us about the importance of community. They teach us that our ability to flourish as individuals is totally tied to the way we relate to each other. And they teach us that cooperation and sharing are the warp and weft that holds communities together and that keeps us from going over the edge. Thank you.